Can psychedelic drugs treat mental illness? The latest long COVID treatment? Psychedelic drugs. Psychedelic drugs could improve your sex life. These headlines are all from the last year, and more like them appear in the news almost daily. They claim that psychedelics could one day help millions of people, whether they suffer from depression, substance abuse, anxiety, PTSD, or even terminal illness. But you know what? These articles really make me mad. Why? Because their sunny celebration is a mirage. It hides an ugly truth that the psychedelic renaissance is built on a foundation of mass looting and lies. Before I explain more about what I mean, let me ask you to imagine that a chemist named John walks into a pharmacy in a country far from his own. He's been suffering from depression since college, and really nothing has worked. The pharmacist suggests a locally made medicine, very inexpensive, and he's shocked to learn that within a day of taking it, he feels better than he has in decades. So once he's back in the US, he decides to help others, while at the same time taking advantage of the economic opportunity by making it commercially available. So he studies the chemistry of the drug, then he synthesizes, patents it, and renames it. It becomes a blockbuster, and it makes John spectacularly wealthy, but what he doesn't do is acknowledge the original source or share his proceeds with the people back in the country where he first encountered the miraculous medicine. How do you feel about what John did? If you're like me, you can really applaud his desire to help others, but be pretty angry that he got rich by ripping somebody else's work off. I mean, after all, he didn't discover the drug in his lab. He bought it in a pharmacy. So I think that he should acknowledge the people who discovered the drug, and he should also share his profits with them. Now, imagine that the source of John's drug was a plant. Would you still be troubled? Probably not. You might say, well, he used his expertise on something that he found in nature, so he has a right to sell the fruits of his labor. And in fact, in most countries, he'd have that right. Indeed, for decades, pharmaceutical companies have done much the same thing by developing drugs from plants they found in countries and places far from their headquarters in the global north. But I think that in both cases, what John did was unjust, whether he passed off somebody else's discovery as his own or developed a drug from a plant that he dug up in some distant country. And to explain why, let me take you to a place that has become my second home. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and my research is based in Oaxaca, Mexico. Oaxaca is probably best known for its mezcal and cuisine, and I freely admit that I am biased, but it really is, hands down, the best in the country. If you have not had Oaxacan food, you really haven't lived. But it's also one of the most linguistically diverse regions on Earth. People living there continue to speak their indigenous languages despite 5 centuries of oppression. So I went to study what people were doing to revitalize and strengthen their languages. So for many years, I lived in a part of the country called the Sierra Mazateca. To most outsiders, though, the Sierra is not famous for its linguistic landscape, but rather for its magic mushrooms. In the middle of the 20th century, researchers discovered that people from the Sierra were using the mushrooms in ritual contexts. This was stunning news. The ritual use of mushrooms was widespread throughout the region for centuries before the Spanish arrived, but historians were convinced that the practice had been eliminated during the colonial era thanks to the Catholic Church's brutal repression. During the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s, hippies learned about the mushrooms and they began going to the Sierra in droves. And outsiders have gone to the region basically ever since in search of the mushrooms. So when I first arrived in the region, I really went out of my way to distance myself from that history. When people said, as everyone did, "Oh, you're here for the mushrooms," I said, no, really self-righteously, no. I'm here to study your language. But that attitude really kept me from listening to what people told me when they said that the sacred plants and their use of them was really central to how they engaged with their language. For example, many of the songwriters I worked with said that they learned to compose music because the mushrooms taught them. After I got better at listening, I met another psychoactive plant, How many of you have heard of salvia? Show of hands, please. So if you say, oh, I have some in my garden, you're probably like me, you're over 40. But if you're younger, you might be thinking about the YouTube salvia, made famous by trip videos like one of Miley Cyrus smoking the plant from a bong, which went viral. Scientists call the plant Salvia divinorum. Its psychoactive molecule is really potent, comparable in strength to LSD. So some leading companies are now studying its use to treat such illnesses as addiction, depression, and chronic pain. But in the Sierra, people have long called the plant by a different name, Ska pastora, or leaf of the shepherdess. And to them, the plant isn't an it, it's a she. Ska pastora isn't as widely known as the mushrooms, but she's much more intimately bound to the region's people. Psychoactive mushrooms can be found across the globe, including here in Rhode Island, but the Sierra is the one place on Earth where Ska pastora grows wild. It's her homeland, but it's also her birthplace because botanists believe that she's a cultigen, meaning brought into the world by deliberate human action, and she survives to this day primarily because people deliberately propagate her. What that means is that people in the Sierra are really fundamentally responsible for the very existence of this plant, having birthed her, cared for, protected, and learned from her for centuries, despite Inquisition trials and other forms of violence. I first met Ska pastora outside of the house where I was living. The mom of the family knew I loved spicy food, so she sent me out into the garden to look for chili peppers. And while I was out there, I noticed a plant off to the side, kind of bent into an arc, a kind of rainbow of green velvety leaves. In the Sierra, arcs mark something as sacred. The family I lived with had bent this plant into an arc because she was sacred, but also because she was kin, bound to this family through bonds of reciprocal care, because by caring for her, people were also caring for each other and also for their community. After people ingest her leaves, Ska pastora opens channels of communication with earth spirits that saturate the Sierra, but they're inaccessible in daily life. Their guidance helps us heal the sick and mend what is broken. But people don't just talk through Ska pastora, they also talk to her, using a term that's perhaps best translated as co-living. People in the Sierra co-live with Ska pastora in ways really different from outsiders do. They sing to her. They offer her prayers, they leave offerings for her, they ask permission to cut and use her leaves. And in exchange, Ska pastora takes them to hidden worlds, hidden realms that are inaccessible, but where they can find truth. But she also changes how they speak to each other by providing the basis for a depth of shared understanding, a depth of shared purpose that's closed off in everyday life. But you won't find any of that in YouTube trip videos or in articles celebrating the plant's therapeutic potential, and that is why they infuriate me. Because they erase the perspectives and contributions of the Sierra's people. And furthermore, they're not alone. Many psychedelic drugs are derived from plants that exist today because indigenous people created and cared for them. But their perspectives and their interests are largely left out of public discourse. Most articles about Ska pastora offer a single sentence of context that's nearly identical to the one used by some Harvard researchers that I interviewed. Quote, Salvia divinorum is a plant that has been used in spiritual rituals for centuries by the Mazatec of Oaxaca. That boilerplate, blip of recognition, radically obscures what generations of Sierra people have accomplished by keeping this remarkable plant alive and what their labor should entitle them to today. Indigenous people have given us a wide range of plants that have revolutionized the economies and cultures of countries around the world. Plants like maize or corn, but also potatoes, tomatoes, avocados, vanilla, beans, squash, and even my beloved chili peppers. Their centuries of experimentation revealed which plants are poisonous, edible, and even psychoactive. And after those discoveries, they began the long process of perfecting the use of these remarkable plants by adjusting the dosage, by controlling their contact with other chemicals and other substances, and by controlling the context. How is that any different from what pharmaceutical companies do? Indigenous people likewise conducted research and development to bring Ska Pastora into the world and to unlock her potential. But unlike pharma researchers, their discoveries aren't accorded the status of intellectual property. The Sierra doesn't look like a lab, and the people who live there aren't running around in white coats. But they too are conducting experiments and collecting knowledge, systematic knowledge about the plant in experiments that they've been conducting for centuries, which means that their clinical trials have tested the plant at a scale and longitudinal depth that utterly outstrips the handful of studies conducted by outsiders. But I'm perhaps even more outraged at what people have done, outsiders have done to the plant herself, where once she was a living being, a member of the family worthy of love and respect, she has now become a mere object, a commodity, an expendable husk from which valuable chemicals can be extracted. This does profound violence to what she is for people from the Sierra, but it also ignores her true magic, which lies not in her ability to alter brain chemicals, to heal individual illness and trauma, to change your mind, but to change how we relate to each other and to the world around us. So, where do these stories leave us? I hope that you are now enraged as well. And if you are, what should you do with that anger? Begin by recognizing and acknowledging the profound debt that we owe Indigenous people. It goes way beyond psychedelic medicine to include all the plants they've given us that are now so integral to our daily lives. Learn about their centuries of co-living with our plant kin and recognize their exclusion from debates and conversations and decisions about the future and present of these plants is profoundly unjust. Listen to them when they say that the true promise of plants like Ska Pastora lies not in their ability to alter neural pathways, but to heal relationships and communities. Despite immense oppression, Indigenous people held open the doors to alternate realities. We owe them so much, and we are missing out on so much by not listening to what they have to say. Finally, act on what you learn. Recognize that what they have given us is very, very important. Make deliberate choices about what you buy, and educate yourself on who benefits or is excluded in the process. Share your awareness with others, because if we want to learn, if we want to live in a better world, if we want to, say, bring what I would call botanical reparations into being, we need to begin by talking about that reality. Support organizations that are, say, promoting patent reform or are fighting to empower Indigenous people. We can all help bring the perspectives of Indigenous people out of the shadows by recognizing what they've given us and by including them in our decisions for the future. Thank you.